Welcome back to the Practical Church Podcast. My name is Dylan Dotson, and this show is all about helping you plant and grow healthy churches. Today, I'm going to share with you 8 ways to preach with more clarity to your people. And as always, this show is brought to you in partnership with Mission Support. They do a number of things that you can check out at missionsupport.com. Briefly want to highlight what they do with graphics and videos here today. You'll be amazed at how outsourcing your graphics and videos and editing and all the stuff you got to do to their media specialists will not just save you time, but actually in the end probably could save you money. And it will make your church feel like it has a professional level media department. So they support simple one-time projects or ongoing comprehensive support. So things like sermon graphics, event graphics, postcards, signage, social media posts, videos, bumpers, testimony story videos, you name it. Be sure to check out missionsupport.com today and maybe outsource some of the areas that are of a frustration to you and your church and also get really good results. And now, 8 ways to preach with more clarity in your sermons. So 8 ways to preach with more clarity. Again, take and leave what you might like, what you don't like, and just be able to think through, not just like writing a sermon and preaching it, but making sure it's communicated, written, and preached in a way that like actually makes sense to people and doesn't feel maybe like there's too much going on or something like that. So I'm going to give you 8 things to think through. Number 1, limit the number of sermon points. Limit the number of sermon points. Now, I'm not saying you only can have like one main idea, though I do, generally speaking, think like building up towards one main idea or one main concept is helpful. That doesn't mean like you literally can only like share one sermon point. But I am saying a lot of times, particularly maybe with newer preachers, younger preachers that haven't done as much, it's just like, you kind of read and study all the things and you want to say all the things and you have, 20 different things you want to say, and it kind of comes across more as like a seminary lecture than like, a sermon for the average person. They could, yes, learn some stuff, which is important, but also apply it to their life. So not just learn like, oh, this is what this Greek word means, or this is what was happening in, the first century, something like that, but like actually apply it. And part of what can happen with preachers is that if you have so many, even if they're like good, even if they're practical, if you have like way too many points, it can be like, okay, so what actually am I listening to? What's the most practically helpful for me? I kind of think of it like this. I excuse me, man, I was holding that sneeze. I read a lot of books, and one of the things, I do like these like little book reviews on X and Instagram and in my personal newsletter at dylandotson.com/best. And one of the things I've learned about, reading, a lot of particularly nonfiction books, and this, I guess in the self-help genre, although I think the title's like not the best or not the most helpful. Anyway, is sometimes books have a lot of really good stuff, but there's so many things it wants you to do. And I think the authors sometimes when they're writing these books are thinking, well, obviously not everyone's going to do everything, but I want to give a lot of different things or steps that they could take, and then they can just choose like maybe the 2 or 3 that's most relevant to them. And when I read books like that, I'm like, well, I could just choose maybe the 2 or 3 things that are relevant to me, but I don't know what to choose because there's so many, and it kind of dilutes. Like, how do I know that I'm choosing the right ones? And so my thing, when I read some of these books is there's a lot of great content, but like you should just really dial in on a couple of main concepts so that when I am done with the book, I can really like tell somebody, hey, here are like 1 or 2 things I took away from the book. Not they gave me 37 principles to try or apply, and I'm not quite sure which one to pick. And so I would just say you could have a lot of good stuff to say, a lot of practical stuff to say, but if it's too much, people aren't going to know what they should do with it. And so I would just say limit the number of sermon points. It's hard to give like a number here because sermon styles and cultures and which I guess what you consider a point, which I'll talk about in the second point here as well, is helpful. I generally think for me when I talk about points are, at least how we do our screens at New City, the sermon points are like the phrases that actually go on our screens. So I might say, a lot of stuff, but doesn't actually make it like a point or a phrase. And so when you have just like a bunch of stuff, it could be hard to know what's going on, especially if some of the points, again, aren't kind of like in sync or building together, but they're kind of just, hey, this is what we learned from these verses, and here's a takeaway from these next 2 verses, and here's another takeaway from these next handful of verses. And they're all biblically true, but they're all like different takeaways. It can be hard to know what's going on. So I would just say, if you got tons of points, then it's going to be unclear like what exactly you want people to do. Even if you say at the end, or maybe even at the beginning or whatever, like, here's the main point for today. but then you go on and give like 17 other points and they're all on the screen, like it really can dilute like what exactly what people do. Which goes with the second point here, which is only having 1 point per slide. Now, again, generally speaking, there could be different reasons why you might have more than 1 point. That's fine. But generally speaking, if you have like a particular point in the sermon that you're trying to communicate, it should be the only thing on the screen. One is because when sometimes people put like lots of points on the screen, like here's like a point and like some subpoints and explainers or whatever. Just like human psychology is whenever you put something new on your screens, your slides or whatever, people are going to read everything that's on the slide before they refocus their attention back on the communicator. So if you got a slide with like a lot of information, people are going to read that entire slide before they listen to you. Now, there might be times where you've got a group of points or something that you want to communicate like all together. My recommendation is to do like one thing at a time. I'm trying to think of an example. Like there's occasionally like maybe like 3 things I want to communicate at once. And maybe I want to do it somewhat quickly and I want them to all be on the screen in case someone wants to like write them down or take notes or whatever. What I'll do in that case is I'll have one at a time, but they'll have them build off each other. So I'll say the first thing and there'll be like 1 point on the screen. Then I'll say the second thing and I'll have the first and second point on the screen. And then I'll say the third thing and I'll have the first, second, and third line or point or whatever on the screen. So that it's not all up front where everyone's reading it before I can explain it. It's kind of like going with me, if that makes sense. But generally speaking, I would recommend keeping 1 point on the screen at a time as you're communicating it so that people really know, hey, here's what I'm talking about. They can write it down if they want. It actually shows them that it's significant. So again, I don't want to give a hard and fast rule here because it's just depending on context and whatever. For at least how I have been doing it the last handful of years at New City is I'll probably shoot anywhere between 3 to 5, maybe not really a 6. Typically it's about 3 to 5 points. At some point during my sermon, a point will go on the screen and I'll emphasize it, talk about it, might have an illustration to back it up, that sort of thing. And I have about 3 to 5 of those on a Sunday where it's the only thing on the screen and then it goes back to the Bible passage or whatever you're doing, your sermon series graphic, whatever. If it's no longer, if what you're talking about is no longer relevant, if you're no longer talking about the point and you got the next thing going on your screen, whatever. I'm just trying to say, I typically do like 3 to 5 of these a sermon. So there's not like a ton. But there's, maybe there is some variety and on a good sermon, depending on the text, but on a good sermon, they're at least all connected in some way. But having 1 point per slide really emphasizes, hey, here's what I am talking about now, or in this part of the sermon. And it helps people, maybe take a note or understand like what exactly you're saying. Again, sometimes if you, for example, only maybe put the scriptures up and you never put your points up, people might like miss what you said. Or even if you repeat it twice, they're like, wait, what was the wording there? And so for us, it's about 3 to 5, for me, about 3 to 5 points per sermon that are actually going to be on the screen. It's the only phrase or one sentence, one phrase. And of course, you can explain it and give illustrations and all that sort of thing, but it's kind of very clear. Here is what I'm talking about. And so if you've got a note taker or anything like that, it's kind of like, I know exactly what you're saying. So you can say a lot of stuff. And I would say too, you can say things, not everything has to necessarily be a screen point. So there are certain things where, in my sermon, I'm like, hey, that's a good concept idea. And I might talk about it for a second, but I'm not actually going to put it on the screen because, again, going back to the first point of this podcast, you want to limit the number of sermon points because it just feels like there's way too much going on. So when you are having points or whatever, or anything on your screen, I would recommend 1 line at a time only. And if you've got multiple things you want to share, maybe do them one at a time so that they're showing up as you're talking about them. So 1 point per slide, generally speaking, again, will help people be more clear what you're actually talking about. Number 3, limit the number of slides. Now, again, this varies, but the general principle here is not a million. Like you don't necessarily want to slide for like every 2 minutes of your sermon. Now, I'm not talking about scripture. Obviously, if you're reading the Bible and you've got multiple scripture slides, if that's how you do it, whatever. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about like points and information and graphics and data and whatever. Now, again, generally speaking, there might be exceptions here when you're trying to explain a concept or you're really going over something confusing or you got a nugget that's like really interesting and you want to expound on it. I'm not talking about that, but I'm just saying, generally speaking, if you have like, I know some people that do this, like 30 or 40 slides per sermon, it's just a lot. And it's a lot for people to keep up with. And I just, generally speaking, wouldn't recommend it. We had one guy who came one time to preach at New City Church, and he preaches like this. And he's a great guy, great pastor, though. He would self-admittedly say, like, he's not the best preacher. And he like emailed our guy who was doing the slide, who does our slides every week, and like all this stuff. It was so funny. He was like, yeah, your guy emailed back and said, yeah, we don't do things like that at New City Church, or we don't do it that way at New City Church. And it was essentially the guy was like, yeah, I'm not putting in 40 of your slides into ProPresenter. Like that's way too much work. I'm not doing that. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying, again, when it comes to clarity, if you are feeling like your sermons lack clarity and for people to know exactly what you're saying, take next steps, this could be it. You could have like way too many slides. So on the other end, you may not have any slides, which again, it could be a problem if like you just have the scriptures and like I said, the previous point, and you don't ever put main points or anything on your screens. Well, then that's also can be muddied. But I've just seen on the other side of it of like way too many slides. Now again, this varies. I'm not saying you need to have a certain amount per sermon, but if there's a lot, it might be kind of hard for people to know, hey, what's actually important about what's being communicated in this sermon. All right, that was number three. Number four, set the sermon up with a question you are going to answer. So a really good book on this is Christ-Centered Preaching by Brian Chappell. And he talks about what's called the fallen condition focus, which is like, hey, what is this? Or I would say maybe what is a, like in this text, what is the fallen condition, or what is a fallen condition that this text is communicating or addressing, especially to the original audience. And the reason I say instead of the, it could be a, because yes, there is one proper interpretation of a scriptural passage, but there are many applications. And so if we're thinking about applications, what is one of the ways that this sermon can be applied? And then what you would do is you would set up the sermon in the beginning with I would recommend not a statement, but a question setting up tension to at least give people a reason to keep listening to you. So let me give you an example. And this sometimes for us at New City, sometimes this is actually a screen point. Like I'll say the question and it'll actually be on the screen. They can write it down if they want. Or sometimes it's not actually a screen point. It just kind of depends on the sermon. But right now we're in a sermon series called A People After God. And we are looking at different people in the Bible, or at least some of their stories. And like what did they did? They were pursuing the Lord in some ways. And what do they do? How can we apply it to our life? So as I'm recording this, we've done the first 2 weeks. The first week was 1 Samuel chapter 1. That's Hannah. And the question I set up the sermon with is, what do you do when you are disappointed with God? Hannah is the mother of Samuel, and she couldn't get pregnant, and she went to the tabernacle in Shiloh and was, weeping and didn't care what everyone else thought, and she was pursuing the Lord, all the things. But regardless, in the beginning of the sermon, I set up by saying, what should you do when you are disappointed with God? Now, you can debate how well I, preach the sermon, that sort of thing. But that's interesting. What do you do? And then typically, at least what I try to do is at the last point of the sermon, I'll reiterate my first question and then I answer it. The last point is typically as best as I can, an answer to that question. So what should you do when you're disappointed with God? The last week, as I'm recording this, we did 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, 1 Kings 22, 23. And it is the story of King Josiah. And the sermon question that I set up the sermon with was, what do you do if you realize you've been getting it all wrong? Maybe in your relationship with God, or, you've been doing something in your life and you're like, oh my goodness, like maybe you realize, hey, in a conversation, or maybe you experienced the consequence of a decision, or maybe you read something and you realize, hey, I thought this about a position and now I realize I was wrong. What do you do when it comes to God? Like if you've been getting something, maybe your view of God, how you've interacted with God, what happens when you realize you've actually been getting it wrong? Now, the reason I set it up that way is because Josiah finds the book of the law, likely a section of Deuteronomy or a scroll of a part of Deuteronomy, when he's clearing out Judah and Jerusalem, and he reads the scroll, and basically they leads Israel in repentance, and they're like, oh my goodness, we have not been following the commands of God like we should. And, here's what he did. And they're talking about how we could apply it to our life. So again, I would just say, one, set up the sermon with a question you are going to answer. Now, you want to try to not make it a cliche, boring question that people already know the answer to. Like, I don't know, let's say you're preaching on a text about money, and it's like, should we be generous? It's like, whether or not people are generous, if that's the way you set up your sermon, they're going to be like, well, yeah, we should, or I know what you're going to say because you're a pastor. That's not helpful. So you want to try to make it somewhat like, I wonder what he's going to say, to give some tension. I had one preaching coach that I worked with one time, and he was like, his phrase was, the sermon is finished when there is no longer any tension. When there's no more tension, that's like the sermon's done. Now, obviously, if you're answering that question with your last point primarily, I mean, you can maybe hint at it, that sort of thing while you're preaching, then you can bring the sermon to the conclusion. So I would just say, set up a question. Now, again, this is just personal preference. This is why I'm not a big fan of when it comes to preaching a sermon, tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them, because that does not induce any tension or reason for me to keep listening. None of your favorite shows or TV shows or movies do that. Like nothing in the beginning opening credits of a movie says, let me tell you what's going to happen here. Because then there's like, well, the movie can still be interesting, but there's no drama, there's no tension, there's no real reason. Like I could doze off or stop listening, and I already know what you're going to say. So that's why me personally, I'm not a big fan of. Let me give you my sermon outline up front. Let me hear the 3 points. I'm going to talk about the sermon, and then you kind of go one by one. I'm not saying it's terrible. I know some people do this really, really well. I'm just saying it does reduce any like tension or reason to keep listening. So I'm a big fan of setting up a question at the beginning of the sermon. Hey, what's like one of the main ideas you're going to address? Set it up as a question, not a statement, because you don't want to answer the question. You want to set up as a question so people will want to keep listening. That was number 4. Number 5, sermon review with others before preaching. I mean, when it comes to clarity, you might hear a lot of people talk about they'll get feedback after, or some preachers have multiple services, and after the first service, they'll put people in the room and get feedback. And I think that's great. I think what's better is getting clarity before you preach. Now, I'm not saying you have to do it this way. This is just how I do it. For years now, I've got a couple of people at New Cities, depending on who's on staff and whatever over the years, where I will talk through a future sermon before I actually preach it. So I've already written the sermon, and they've got the manuscript stuff, all my notes, on a Google Drive where we have it. And I just literally talk through everything I've written. And then there are some points, as soon as I'm finished, there's some points of clarification I ask. And then I'm just like, hey, what made sense? What didn't? What's really helpful is, for some of my sermon points, going back to like limit the number of sermon points, 1 per slide, is there are a handful of places in the sermon where I have a sermon point. And what I'll do sometimes is, because I know I'm getting help, is I'll like actually write multiple points. I'll reword it multiple different ways for other people to get feedback. Hey, which is the most clear, or which makes the most sense? And so honestly, I've said this before, it's one of the best things I do for clarity for the sermon is to talk through it with other people. I don't like preach it. Like we're all just sitting down at the table and I talk through it. And then I just get feedback. And there are times where there's not a ton of feedback, but it's still really valuable to me to like, okay, I wrote it one day, and another day I'm going to talk through it again. So I'm not as emotionally tied if I need to make a change, or like maybe there was something I wrote that made sense to me as I was writing it, but then a couple of days later, or whenever we do the sermon review, however long it is after I wrote the sermon, I'm like, wait, what? I don't even know what I meant by that. And so what's helpful is, I obviously, when I was writing it, knew what I meant, but when I was communicating what I wrote to someone who didn't know inside of my head what I was thinking, it didn't make any sense. So a sermon review is helpful, just to talk through it before you preach it with other people, but also then because it makes you kind of realize, oh, this doesn't make sense, it's confusing, but then also you get feedback. Hey, have you thought about this? Now, again, with my sermon review, I'm not asking them to write the sermon. I'm not asking them to bring their thoughts about the passage beforehand. I mean, they can if they want, but I'm not asking that, because again, I have to preach a sermon at the end of the day. What I'm asking to, here is my sermon. Help me for points of clarification or illustrations or things that are confusing, or maybe there's an insight or something about this passage that you think it would be helpful for me to hit on. And you can do this as just one person. And just having someone helpful to like talk through, hey, what's it going to look like? To me, it's been one of the best things that I do. It's probably the best thing that I do about my sermon writing process, especially when it comes to clarity. They can say, hey, this doesn't make sense, or what are you trying to say there? Or this point is kind of confusing. And there are times where we don't answer it right there. Sometimes I'll just make a note and be like, hey, I need to reword this section, or reword this point, or work on this section because it was just confusing. So it's not like I got to fix it right there with whoever's doing this with, but it helps just bring to mind, hey, this was helpful, this was not. So number 5 was sermon review with others before preaching. Again, it takes about anywhere from an hour to 70-ish minutes on average. I mean, I guess if you have, I personally like, other than me, 2, maybe 3 people. If you have more than that, it can get kind of long, and like it can become a let's write a sermon by consensus, which is not helpful. But other than me, I think having 2 more people is kind of like, I would say between 2-ish. So 1 to 3, other than yourself, is kind of the ideal number for this. If it gets too big, I found that it's like people are afraid to say something, or it can become sermon by committee, which is not helpful. So sermon review before others, before preaching, really helpful. Let's see, number 6 is to use illustration and stories, which, I think generally speaking, especially if you listen to this, you're probably, yeah, I agree with that. My kind of philosophy is I want to do at least 2 or 3 in the sermon. Now, I don't have to have a story for every illustration, but at least a couple of them, because that's also a place not just to, illustrate, hey, here's what this point means, but also to invite people back in, because everybody at some point is going to kind of like doze off or, daydream during your sermon. And anytime you tell a story, it invites people back in. And it also gives people like, I don't know, for lack of a better word, I'll call like a brain break. Even if they are tracking with you, it kind of lets them like, hey, chill out for a second, just to listen to a story. So I would use them. Ideally, you would start with your sermon with something to kind of draw people in, and then have maybe 2 or 3 others. It depends on the sermon. Again, there's not always an illustration for every point. But to me, the rule of thumb is at least 2 to 3, like, decent, either personal or stories or whatever to help illustrate a point. Again, it can bring clarity because it can help you explain something that maybe might feel theoretical or philosophical, make a point like actual practical, and again, invites people in. So using stories and illustrations, can make you bring clarity to your point, because like, well, here's what this point is, but let me show you what I mean by it. So that's going to be helpful. Number 7, the more space between initial writing and the preaching of the sermon, the better. Now, again, this is generally speaking. Here's what I mean. The more space you have between, hey, I wrote the sermon and where I preach the sermon is better. A, because you're not as emotionally attached, so you're more likely to like critique it or to change it. And again, like I just said, if I wrote something that made sense to me at the time, and then I read it a few days later or a week or 2 later, and I'm like, I don't know what's going on there, it obviously it's not going to make sense. But if you write a sermon, let's say on Saturday night, and you're like, oh, it's all connected in your brain, but then you don't communicate it well, or actually doesn't really make that much sense when you preach it Sunday morning, it's not going to be good. It can be confusing. So again, my process, I'm not saying I do my process, but my process is I'll write typically it is Tuesdays. Sometimes it's Wednesday if I got something going on, is my sermon writing day. For a sermon I'm going to preach in about 4-ish weeks. And then on Monday, I do my sermon review about an upcoming sermon, which is, it could be, if I wrote on Wednesday, the sermon review could be Monday for that sermon, or sometimes it's the 2 weeks later. Regardless, there's a couple days space so that I can go over it with other people and not be as like emotionally attached to it. Because like, yeah, this is confusing. And then again, if it was confusing not just to them but to me, I can go back and fix it. So I know my thing isn't normal. If you like most people do, if you write your sermon and the same week that you preach it, I would recommend like a Tuesday, like or a little bit earlier in the week, like write the sermon and give it some time to review and to breathe and to bring clarity, to edit it when it's like, hey, I'm gonna write it, I'm gonna give it some space, I'm gonna come back to it and be like, does that really make sense? Now I know there are some really excellent communicators that I know that write their sermon all day Thursday, and then they have like a Thursday night service. So I'm not saying everyone has to do this way, although like this one person that I have in mind is just like a really gifted communicator. He's a above average gifted communicator, which most people are not. And so, maybe you can get away with some things that the average person couldn't. So I just would say, if you're struggling with clarity, I would just say, hey, is my sermon writing process, am I writing the sermon last minute, getting it done? Is anyone else reviewing it? And am I just like finishing it and preaching it on Sunday? And then I realize, oh, that was kind of confusing. And if I had written it earlier in the week, or maybe even the week before, and then just reviewed it the week I was preaching it, would I be able to bring some clarity to some sections that were kind of confusing? So the more space between the initial writing and the preaching, I think, generally speaking, can help you bring a little bit more clarity to your sermon. And then number 8, last but not least, I would recommend the vast majority, at least in Western American context, because again, the cultural styles difference for sure. But in a generally speaking Western American context, I would recommend preaching 40 minutes or under. And for most of us, that's under. Probably around 30 to 35 minute mark is what I would say. Now, I always like pat myself on the back here because I was saying this before COVID, and I knew some guys, that were kind of like, 55 minutes, 50 minutes. And then during COVID, they're like, yeah, shorter sermons are a little bit better. And I'm like, yeah, they are. And here's what happens though. There are exceptions to this rule. And some of the exceptions to this rule are really gifted and good communicators. Some of your favorite preachers probably preach 45, 50, 55-ish minutes. And so what happens is we try to replicate the people that we look up to the most when we either don't have the experience, gifting, or preaching skill that they have. And so we try to do what they do when we can't do what they do. And so my recommendation is 40 minutes or less. Now, again, there's generally speaking, there are times where things are different. I think for most preachers, I would recommend 30 to 35 minutes. Part of that is because it actually requires you to think through with clarity your sermon, not just to do a theology dump on here's all the stuff I learned and let me just like say it all. So it requires you to actually like bring clarity to your sermon, because you got to actually pick out what actually makes sense and what doesn't. And then, you could preach a great sermon and go 10 minutes long, and it's like a great sermon at 32 minutes becomes a really bad sermon at 42 minutes that nobody remembers because you just went on and on. So I know some of your preaching heroes and some of mine might preach 45, 50 minutes a week, but you are not them. So I just would recommend you not do that. And again, the added benefit is people aren't, you aren't going to lose people because you're going too long, and it's going to force you to be a little bit more clear about what you're saying and what you're writing, as opposed to just doing kind of like a big dump on everybody. And then again, it's like, what was the point of that sermon? What was the main takeaway? When you preach too long, like I said in the beginning, my kind of book example, it becomes like a book that has like 30 things that all are helpful if you implement them, but it's way too much to choose from. And so you end up, at least for me, I end up leaving the book being like, I couldn't really even tell you one thing to do because there was too many things that they told me to do. So those are 8 ways to preach more clarity. Again, I'll iterate them real quick. Limit the number of sermon points. Number 1. Number 2, 1 point per slide, generally speaking. 3, limit the number of slides. 4, this can vary, but you don't want like a million of them. Number 4, set the sermon up with a question that you are going to answer, because it'll make people want to listen more, and it'll make you be more clear on what you're going to say in your sermon. 5, sermon review with others before preaching. 6, use stories, illustrations. Number 7, the more space between the initial writing and then the actual preaching of the sermon, I think the better. And then number 8, preach 40 minutes or under. And for most of us, that will be under. And those are 8 ways you can preach with more clarity. So here is my observation and reminder for this episode. It's this, that most people, if you have a plan that most people can't do or won't do, it's not a plan. I was reminded of this. I was at a church plan assessment last week, at least the week that I'm recording this. And, part of our church plan assessments that we do is we talk about their discipleship strategy, evangelism plan, that sort of thing. And a lot of these church planners come in with either a lot of philosophy, but no actual practical, here's what we're going to do. Or I got both of these guys this time. So a lot of philosophy for one, or like a plan that was so complex and detailed that pretty much hardly anyone's ever going to do it. And so whether it is a church-wide ministry or a church-wide program or a ministry-specific program, my recommendation is to come up with a plan that is tangible and actionable that people can actually do. So for example, what does it look like to make disciples at our church? And you could talk about how do we grow people in a relationship with Jesus, and here are like the 3 things that we primarily focus on. Now, they might have other ancillary things that people that want to dive deeper can do, but like, what are the kind of the 3 things that we're mainly like 85% of our church is doing? And if you're doing these things, you're a partner or a member at our church, you're going to be growing closer to Jesus. What happens is if you have like a 10-step plan that's really detailed and complex, nobody can actually do it. And therefore it's not actually a plan. It might sound good in theory, and it might sound impressive to other pastors and people in ministry, but it's not practical. So a plan that most people in your church can't do or won't be able to complete is not an actual plan. So again, in your ministries, in your church-wide pushes, whatever, they're trying to get people to do things for, sign up for, make sure it's something that people can actually do. Today's personal growth tip has to do with the idea of that you need to think of your future self. Here's the reality. If you won't do it now, you won't do it in the future. And so what happens is we all love to believe our future selves will have the willpower and the determination to do the thing that we don't want to do today, which is always, I'll start eating better tomorrow, or I'll start exercising in the new year, or I'll spend more time with my kids once the work project is over, then I'll do it. I'll spend less time on social media next week. It's always why in the fall time we start thinking of potential New Year's resolutions, and we sometimes get excited about that because we don't have to start until January 1. And so we're like, well, the last week of December, Christmas, New Year's, it's just kind of relaxing. I'm not going to actually I'm not going to do it this week. I'll do it next week. Unfortunately, however, our future self is no better able to will itself together than our current self is. In other words, you should never trust your future self. So if you want to make changes to your diet, only make changes in your diet if you're willing to do it permanently. I've got friends that have done this, they do this thing, they come back to it. They do this thing, they come back to it. The better approach is to actually make a couple small changes that you'll be able to follow like for the rest of your life, or generally speaking, for the rest of your life. You should start your new exercise plan now. Again, there's nothing special about January 1. You should create better work boundaries now, because there's always going to be another work project to work on. You should decide today how much time you will allow yourself to spend on social media, not next week or next month. Your future self will be no better disciplined than you are today if your habits do not change. So, start now and your future self will thank you. Today's ministry question comes from church planner I was working with last week at our church planning assessment that I help out with Acts 29, our network. And basically this guy came in here, and what I described to him was playing a lot of defense. So he had some past ministry experiences that weren't great, some things that he was afraid of. And so his plans, some of his plans for his church and discipleship and all that sort of thing was all reactive. Well, I don't want to do this, and I don't want to do this, and I don't want to do this. And so at some point, the team was assessing him, and I was kind of like, hey, like you're playing a lot of defense here. Here's what I don't like. Here's what happened to me. Here's what I want to guard against. I don't know what you actually want your strategy in this church to look like. In other words, you need to play offense. And his question was, well, how do you play offense? And so here's my recommendation for like all church leaders, really leaders of any organization at all. Obviously in this context, we're talking about ministry, pastors, church leaders, is that you should play offense. You should think through that if you love Jesus, you're walking with Jesus, you have the Spirit of God living inside of you. Man, if you have desires and things that excite you, that are biblically grounded and encourage other people to follow Jesus, man, you should run that play. You should do those things. Because here's the deal. People will always want to follow an excited leader. There's a lot of different ways you can make disciples and evangelize and, do your church services. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could do it. The way that's the best, most effective is the ones that you're excited about. Again, all the caveats, following Jesus, biblical, blah, blah, blah. But as a leader, man, it's like, what do you want, for example, your groups to look like? What do you want serving to look like? What do you want your services to look like? What do you want your church-wide, discipleship, or even just like your individual discipleship of others? What do you want it to look like? If there's an area in your church right now that's struggling, or you're wanting to make a change and you're not quite sure, okay, this isn't working, but we need to make a change. My question is, what do you want it to be? What would actually make you excited and joy-filled? And that doesn't mean it's not going to be hard work, or there's going to be points of discouragement or things about it that you don't want to do. But generally speaking, man, what do you want to do? Man, play some offense. Play some offense. If you do so, people will also be more excited to join into what is going on. So again, in my experience talking to pastors and planners, it's like we kind of feel bad that if I have a desire and I want to do something, I shouldn't. I should be miserable and kind of want to suffer all the time because I guess in our minds that's more holy. I don't know. My encouragement is the opposite. You've got the Spirit of God living inside of you. You're loving Jesus. You're trying to follow Jesus, and you want other people to follow Jesus as well. What excites you? What ministry, what service plan, what style, whatever excites you the most? That's what you should focus on. You should play offense. So as always, thanks so much for joining me today on the Practical Church podcast. If you want more from Mission Support, be sure to check out missionsupport.com. Graphics, videos, and a whole host of other things, bookkeeping, payroll, which is what we use them for at New City Church, and a host of other things. Check them out. One of the best things about Mission Support is they don't lock you into long-term contracts, so you can use them as long as they're useful. MissionSupport.com. If you want more from me, you can go to DylanDotson.com/best to sign up for my weekly Best Minute newsletter. And if you want to connect with other like-minded ministry people, ask questions, kind of get better, if you're on Facebook, be sure to join the Practical Church Facebook group. And I'll be back with you in 2 weeks for another episode of the Practical Church podcast.